Madwoman and Attic, The Woman Writer in the 19th Century Literary Imagination, is a book written by Sandra M. Gilbert and Susan Gubar, published in 1979. The book is a feminist literary analysis that examines the portrayal and representation of women in 19th century literature, particularly in the works of male authors. Here is a brief summary of some key ideas from Madwoman in the Attic. The Madwoman figure. Gilbert and Gubar introduce the concept of the Madwoman in the Attic, which symbolizes the repressed and marginalized female voices within literary texts. They argue that female characters are often depicted as either angelic or monstrous, with no space for complex and autonomous identities. The Madwoman represents the hidden desires, rebellions, and creativity of women that are suppressed by societal norms. The double bind. The authors explore the idea of the double bind, referring to the conflicting expectations placed on women in society. Women are expected to conform to societal ideals of femininity, but if they assert their agency or exhibit unconventional behavior, they risk being labeled as mad or deviant. The double bind restricts women's autonomy and limits their representation in literature. Reinterpretation of literary texts. Gilbert and Gubar offer new interpretations of classic literary works by male authors, such as Jane Austen, Charlotte Brontë, and Emily Dickinson. They argue that these texts often contain hidden subtexts that reflect the anxieties, desires, and frustrations of the female characters. They delve into the symbolism, imagery, and narrative structures to unveil the submerged narratives of women's experiences. The female literary tradition. The authors examine the emergence of a female literary tradition in the 19th century, challenging the idea that women writers lacked creativity and talent. They discuss how women writers, despite facing social and institutional barriers, found ways to express their voices through writing and contributed to the development of feminist literary aesthetics. The importance of writing as liberation. Gilbert and Gubar emphasize the significance of writing as a means of liberation and self-expression for women. They argue that through writing, women reclaim their agency, challenge societal expectations, and create alternative narratives. They celebrate the power of women's words and the potential for literature to disrupt patriarchal norms. Madwoman in the Attic is a landmark work in feminist literary criticism that explores the representation of women in 19th century literature. Gilbert and Gubar's analysis highlights the complex ways in which gender, power, and literature intersect, and the book continues to be influential in shaping feminist literary theory and interpretation. The binary oppositions. Gilbert and Gubar examine the binary oppositions present in literary texts, particularly in relation to gender. They argue that traditional literary works often present women as passive, submissive, and confined to domestic spaces, while men are depicted as active, assertive, and associated with the public sphere. They critique these rigid gender roles and highlight the need for more nuanced and complex portrayals of women. The female authorship. The authors discuss the challenges faced by women writers in a male-dominated literary tradition. They explore how women writers have been marginalized, dismissed, or forced to adopt male pseudonyms to gain recognition for their work. They emphasize the importance of recognizing and valuing women's contributions to literature. The myth of the great author. Gilbert and Gubar challenge the notion of the great author as an individual genius and highlight the collaborative and communal aspects of literary production. They argue that the traditional focus on male authors has overshadowed the collective efforts of women in shaping literary history. They call for a re-evaluation of literary canon to include marginalized voices. The female Gothic. The authors examine the genre of the female Gothic and its significance in representing women's fears, desires, and struggles. They analyze works such as Charlotte Bronté's, Jane Eyre, and Emily Bronté's, Wuthering Heights, to explore how these texts provide a space for women's exploration of forbidden desires, hidden identities, and suppressed emotions. Sisterhood and solidarity. Gilbert and Gubar emphasize the importance of sisterhood and solidarity among women writers. They highlight how women have historically supported and influenced each other's work, forming networks and communities that transcend traditional literary boundaries. They argue for the value of recognizing and celebrating women's literary collaborations. The female reader. The authors discuss the role of the female reader in interpreting and engaging with literary texts. They argue that women readers have the power to challenge and subvert the patriarchal narratives present in literature. They encourage women to assert their agency as readers and actively participate in shaping the meaning of texts. Madwoman in the Attic offers a comprehensive analysis of the representation of women in literature and the struggles faced by women writers. Gilbert and Gubar's work has had a profound influence on feminist literary theory and has paved the way for further explorations of gender, power, and representation in literature. The influence of madness. Gilbert and Gubar explore the motif of madness in literature and its connection to women's experiences and creative expression. They argue that madness is often used as a metaphor for women's nonconformity to societal norms and their resistance to patriarchal control. They discuss how female characters who exhibit signs of madness challenge traditional gender roles and disrupt the stability of the narrative. The subversion of literary conventions. The authors examine how women writers subvert and challenge literary conventions in their works. They analyze the strategies employed by women authors to break free from traditional narratives and explore alternative perspectives. They highlight the ways in which women's writing defies and disrupts established literary norms. The ambiguity of female identity. Gilbert and Gubar explore the ambiguity and complexity of female identity in literature. They argue that female characters often face conflicting expectations and are torn between societal roles and personal desires. They examine the portrayal of female characters as divided selves, struggling to reconcile different aspects of their identities. Rewriting canonical texts. The authors discuss the practice of rewriting and reimagining canonical texts from a feminist perspective. They highlight the importance of women writers reclaiming and reinterpreting literary works to challenge and subvert patriarchal narratives. They examine examples of feminist literary revisions and adaptations that offer alternative readings and empower female characters. Language and silence. Gilbert and Gubar examine the relationship between language, power, and silence in literature. They explore how women's voices have been marginalized or silenced within literary texts and discuss the strategies employed by women writers to reclaim their voices and assert their presence through writing. The intersection of race and gender. While the book primarily focuses on gender, Gilbert and Gubar acknowledge the intersection of race and gender in literature. They discuss how women writers of color face unique challenges and explore the ways in which race intersects with gender in shaping the experiences and representations of women characters. Madwoman in the Attic is a rich and comprehensive exploration of women's representation and authorship in literature. Gilbert and Gubar's work offers a feminist critique of traditional literary canons and provides a foundation for understanding the complexities of gender, identity, and power in literary texts. The problematic female archetypes. The authors examine the portrayal of women in literature through the lens of archetypes such as the angel and the monster. They argue that these archetypes limit women's representation to narrow and reductive stereotypes, denying them agency and complexity. Gilbert and Gubar call for the deconstruction and reimagining of these archetypes to allow for more authentic and multidimensional female characters. Language and the construction of gender. The authors explore how language and literary conventions contribute to the construction and perpetuation of gender roles and hierarchies. They analyze the ways in which language is gendered and how it reflects and shapes societal perceptions of masculinity and femininity. They advocate for the development of new modes of language and narrative that challenge gendered norms and enable more inclusive and diverse representations. The role of literature in cultural change. Gilbert and Gubar discuss the potential of literature to catalyze cultural change and challenge existing power structures. They argue that literature has the power to shape and reshape societal attitudes and beliefs, particularly regarding gender. They examine how women writers have used their works as vehicles for social critique, resistance, and transformation. The influence of psychoanalytic theory. The authors engage with psychoanalytic theory, particularly the work of Sigmund Freud, to analyze the portrayal of women in literature. They critique Freud's theories for their male-centered perspective and the ways in which they pathologize women. They offer alternative readings and interpretations that challenge Freudian notions and reframe women's experiences. The continuation of patriarchy in literature. Gilbert and Gubar argue that patriarchal ideologies persist in literature, even in works produced by women writers. They highlight the ways in which women writers may internalize and perpetuate patriarchal norms and biases in their works, often as a result of societal pressures and expectations. They call for a critical examination of women's writing to uncover and challenge these internalized patriarchal elements. The importance of female literary criticism. The authors emphasize the necessity of female literary criticism to provide alternative perspectives and interpretations of literary works. They argue that women's experiences and voices have historically been marginalized in literary criticism and advocate for the inclusion of diverse feminist perspectives in the analysis and interpretation of literature. Madwoman in the Attic is a seminal work in feminist literary criticism that challenges traditional literary interpretations and offers new insights into the representation of women in literature. Gilbert and Gubar's analysis continues to shape feminist scholarship and contribute to ongoing discussions about gender, representation, and power in literary texts.